I'm Matthew Clementi. Welcome to this great lecture conversation that's being hosted by Guestbook for the Hosting the Earth series this year in conjunction with the Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture series through the Lynch School at Boston College. Just to give a little context of what we're doing in this series, the Hosting the Earth series, this is part of the Psychologies of the Earth section of the series, is a speaker series that's being put together through the Guestbook Project in order to think through, talk about the ways in which that we both play host and guest to the Earth in order to consider the complexities of the ecological crisis. And in this section of the series, done again in conjunction with the Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture series, we'll be thinking about how psychologists and philosophers interested in the psychological sciences can think their way through the ecological crisis. Today, I'm joined by Jim Morley. He's a professor of clinical psychology at Ramapo College in New Jersey and the editor of the Journal of Phenomenological Psychology. And it's a great honor and pleasure to be here today with Jim. Jim, I want this to be very conversational. You know, we've already been having a great discussion leading into this, you and I on the side here. But I'm really interested to start us off, just to get the conversation going, with what you kind of make of the theme of hosting the Earth. Of course, in many ways, Guestbook is interested in this idea of hosting the stranger. And being host means both being hospitable to the other, to that which comes to us from outside, the stranger, but also being willing to play the role of guest and the reciprocity that exists between us and others and how we can reciprocate that role. So just to kind of lead in, how is it possible to play host to the Earth and guest to the Earth? And what does this mean for your research and your interests?
Well, it's a beautiful idea, and the Guestbook Project is something I've been enamored of all along, and it's been mostly directed towards human conflict. And this new project, this new orientation, this initiative is towards the issues of the ecological crisis. And I think it's a really interesting frame to be both. We are of the earth. We are guests, but we're also engaged in caring for the earth. We're hosts. They're both there, and it's a very Merleau-Pontian theme, of course. And it in itself is a new way of thinking that is kind of the flashlight that's going to get us out of the tunnel we're in here, which is to overcome the linear dualistic kind of thinking that got us into this mess. And I like the idea of hosting and guesting because it frames the problem in human relational terms. And I think that's the only way to do this, is that human relational terms is the only real language that we can understand. And it's the only frame we can operate from. And that's where I'd like to go in our discussion. I'd like to up this a bit. I want to go in the direction of human relations as the frame for the problem. Most psychologists, most of my peers in eco psychology and such, they've talked about the subject-object problem. A lot of them have been going towards, changing our consumer behavior, and it's like that's all important. And as we say in logic, it's necessary but not sufficient. And I'd like to go a little deeper with some ideas that I was very fortunate to be exposed to when I was an undergraduate, and I took a course on. I studied with a very famous anarchist named Murray Bookchin. I don't know if he's famous, but he's famous outside of America, put it that way. And he put ideas in my head that have sort of grown throughout my life, and I'd like to sort of express some of them and tell you where I've gone with it. But the key thing I'd like to talk about is the concept of domination. And we think of domination. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot in hoity-toity continental thought, and it's often directed towards the dominators and a critique of the dominators. And I think we need to go deeper than that I think we need to understand how it's built, it's very hardwired into our almost metaphysical presuppositions about reality. And I think that's the key issue, is exorcising this demon that is the presupposition of the necessity of domination of each other and therefore nature. If I could just, the thesis is that we project our belief in our own human nature onto nature, and that's the issue. Okay, sorry I interrupted you.
No, no, I mean, I was responding really to what you're saying, because I think one of the threads that you're pulling out that's so important and so apt is that we can't think of our relation outside of the way that we relate to one another. And so it is true, I'm obviously, one of my main interests is in psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic thought. And there's this constant question of how sadism relates to our relations to one another. Are we going to try and possess the other? Are we going to try and subjugate the other? Are we going to try and force our wills upon the other? And to see in psychological terms that our relation to others is impacting our relation to the world itself.
That's
it both
exactly
precedes
right.
us, we're born into it, so we receive the world, but then also we go out into the world and do things to it, right?
Yes.
It's very, very interesting in how our dynamics, even within our family life, relate to our dynamics in relation to the world. We're born to parents and to a family, and then we go on and have our own family and our own relations. And sometimes we replicate what's been either done to us or how we've related to previous relationships into future relationships. And what you're saying, which is so fascinating to me, is that we don't just do this in relation to one another. We do this in relation to everything, and in particular, in this context, the world itself, which
Yes.
I'd like you to kind of unpack some more. I'm fascinated by that.
Sure. It's almost, it's hardwired into us, like Husserl's natural attitude. It's just so wired into us. And it's hard to even talk about because it's impossible for people to imagine. A good example of this is our relationship with drugs and sexuality. But sticking with the war on drugs, it's been a beautiful, it's almost like an operatic drama of everything wrong with our relationship with nature. We decide to police our desires through the war on drugs, and it's backfired monstrously. Okay, and we could go into details about that, but even the idea of policing, and one of the insights that I've had, I haven't seen this anywhere, but it just kind of came to me once, that all of human history, if you think of it, going back to whenever we stopped hunter-gathering, is one big, huge panic about who is in charge. All of history, it's a panic. We got this consciousness, this amazing gift of awareness. And what we've done is we've squandered it on this fear of who's in charge. You think of, the Hegelian master-slave dialectic. There's a lot of examples in the history of philosophy about this. The first thing we do is we worry about who's in charge. And if you think of it, it's the driving engine of human history, is the terror of our freedom and the need to either rebel against someone controlling us, or to at least control someone before we get controlled. And we play it out in our relations with our children. And that's where psychoanalysis was beautiful. Okay, that's where the importance of modern psychology, I think, is the discovery of childhood as something important and needing care and attention. But we do it with animals. We do it with the way we just pack capitalism. And not Melanie Klein, but Naomi Klein's wonderful book is this kind of endless robber baron, rampaging, rapist kind of capitalism on the earth, and no one's stopping to question. The other thing too is we don't have a climate. I mean, she's right. We don't have a climate crisis. We have a capitalism crisis. We need to understand that. And what's running capitalism is this terror, of this anxiety that goes it goes back into English history, you could say. But um, it's so big, and you see it emerging, getting articulated very clearly in Machiavelli. You know, uh, his whole sort of map or manual for how to get and hold power. But you see it most expressed in History of Ideas, I think, in Hobbes. Hobbes says it very clearly that he believes, and this is a very English thing, that the social contract is based on a terror of one another. That we have a social contract to protect ourselves from each other. And the fundamental presupposition here, and this is what we have to talk about, is that humans are evil. And that's where I think the key, if I was thinking like a psychoanalyst, the core belief here is that we are, at the core value, at the heart and soul of the whole crisis, is that we believe we're evil. And if we believe we are evil, we project that onto nature as evil and something that needs to be policed and controlled. And the watchword is, you know, society as a policing. We have to police each other. We need to police nature. We need to control. We need to dominate. We need to, you know, and all that patriarchy means, okay? And it's a very different thing from the other view of things, you know, and William James even speaks of this in religious terms. He speaks of morbid-minded spirituality versus healthy-minded spirituality. Remember from the Varieties. And, you know, and what he's thinking of the Quakers versus the Puritans. And the Puritans, of course, have the Calvinistic notion that humanity is inherently evil and needs to be controlled and dominated, and our desires need to be controlled and dominated. And the Quakers had the opposite view. They believe that we're all God's children and we all have God's light shining through us. All we need to do is wake up to it. And that's kind of an antagonism in American history, and it's, I think, played out across human history, is the positive versus negative. And it's so interesting when I teach my students, and I use them as kind of data. When I teach Machiavelli, they love Machiavelli because they get it. You know, so political philosophy is just gobbledygook to them, but Machiavelli, they understand it, so they like it. They recognize that it is what they already believe. They love Machiavelli, and it's terrifying to me. And even though I give the critique and the problem with means and ends and all that, it doesn't get through. It doesn't always get through. Some, you'll get bright ones that get it, but a lot of them, they don't. They just like having their own presuppositions reinforced by Machiavelli. And when you teach more positive, anthrophilic, if I may make up that word, they kind of resist it. They see it as idealistic and unreal. So we're up against a challenge of these core beliefs, this natural attitude that we are inherently evil. And I think that's the heart and soul of the problem, is getting this. And by the way, when Richard writes about Abraham accepting the strangers into the tent, that's an act of trust and faith in human nature. That's an act, that's basically an affirmation of decency. It's a risk, of course, but I think it comes down to this. It is this basic core belief. Abraham says, I'm going to trust, which means basically a faith in the decency of the strangers. And that's what we don't, that's what really is a tricky thing to do, is how do we develop a means by which people can make this faith in the decency of each other and, of course, nature.
So along these lines, and what you're really teasing out here is this dividing line in how we view one another, how we view ourselves even, and how we view our relation to the world as one between trust and fear. You know, can we trust one another? And what you just said is, I think, really resonated with me, is that there's a huge risk in trusting the other, right? You don't trust the other knowing that it's going to work out. You trust the other with the hope and the possibility that it might work out, but also the risk that it really might not. And in your comments on how we dominate each other, how we police, how we dominate nature, what I was thinking is that out of that lack of trust and out of that fear, of course, we try and control and prevent bad things from happening. But as we see in relationships, I mean, our own lives bear witness to this, but as we see now in kind of ecological,
Mm.
the attempt to control often provokes the thing that we're fearing to come to fruition,
It's a
right?
circle. Yeah.
Right. When we try and dominate and control and assert our will over others, over the earth, what we do is actually bring upon ourselves the crisis that we're trying to stem off. And I guess one of the things that I'd like to kind of unpack is both that idea and how that plays out psychologically, relationally, but also there's a real question for me here about what it would, how it's possible to trust, because it seems like we're talking about something, as you said, it's hardwired into us
Mm.
to be controlling, dominant, to have this fear. You know, the world is much bigger than us. You know, I'm thinking of Camus right now, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We have this moment where we recognize that the world is not a brother, but a stranger. And it's big and it's frightening and it overwhelms us. It's absurd, he says. We can't imagine it, we can't understand it. And all of a sudden it reveals itself. And in that confrontation, we feel our own impotency and weakness and vulnerability, right? And the idea of trust is one of staying with the vulnerability rather than trying to control.
Yeah.
But how do we do it? And is it possible? I mean, this is a big question.
Well, you know, I love they brought up Camus because to me, the impression Camus made on me was The Plague. And there he talks about the way out as community. That's his response to the stranger, is the plague. And we are living in a time of plague. And we, in all kinds of levels of that metaphor. And the call is to, it's a crisis and it's a call to community. And that's the way out. The only way out we got is each other. And how to make that happen. So the crisis kind of forces us into community if we're aware of the crisis a little more, but it could also force us into a police state at the same time. So it really, that's the nature of a crisis. Could go either way. In terms of the trust issue, yeah, you're right. The core of trust is it's not guaranteed when you wager your hand, when you when you make that risk. It's a risk. All trust is a risk. You can help mitigate things by encouraging people to trust one another with some basic scientific facts. That can help. So for example, I could do a long rap here on the scientific facts that support the thesis that humans are inherently cooperative and inherently caring. There's biological evidence built into the very structure of the human body. And I'm not talking the lived body of Milo, but I'm talking about the natural body, okay? That you know, evolutionary anthropologists have been pointing this out for decades, that there's reasons to actually believe, there's evidence to believe that you know, evolution itself, okay, our biology is oriented towards affiliation and pro-social behavior. But getting people to believe these facts, it's kind of like, it's like you could present the facts, but the natural attitude keeps you from even seeing that. But I think the one way of breaking through might be a better way of presenting the facts, you know, getting it out there. You know, and that's where perhaps art and literature would come in handy to break through the defenses, so to speak. But the evidence is in that, you know, Darwin, one of the things about, you know, most people, they learned Darwin from their gym teacher who told you it was about survival of the fittest and basically presented Darwin as if might makes right, you know, that organisms survive by being aggressive, which is completely a perversion of Darwin's idea of adaptation. Darwin says we adapt to our ecosystem, and that adaptation, most successful adaptations are pro-social cooperative behaviors, both interspecies and exterior to other species and the environment. And there's all kinds of ways of understanding the human body as it's structured to show that we're in our design. we are affiliative beings, not aggressive at all. We have no claws. We have no fangs. We have globular heads, and we don't even have any fur. And the whole of the structure of the human body is its tactility and touch and neediness. We're mammals to the 10th power. Okay, we never detached. We metaphorically, we never detached from the breast. We're always attached. We're always breastfeeding our children all through our lives, at least symbolically. We're always caring for each, unlike any other species. We are the most affiliative and caring species, in the known universe. And all the facts are in. We have no snout. Our genitals are rotated towards the front, which means that sex is face to face. Okay, primarily, and our sexual structures are designed so that we are sexual before we're born and to the moment of our death. And what is sexuality but affiliation? What is it but pro-life? What's more pro-life than sex? And so we're designed to be perpetually open for sexuality, and both emotionally and literally. And it goes on and on and on, the way our bodies are structured. And so there's a lot of evidence to say we are cooperative. And there's a guy named Kropotkin, who was known as a Russian anarchist theorist, but he was actually a biologist and an evolutionary theorist. People don't know this very much. Stephen Jay Gould talks about him. And Kropotkin said that he was very much freaking out about the social Darwinists. The social Darwinists, Darwin's kind of neutral about human nature. Most sort of neutral, maybe, but he gave a lot of fodder, being English and influenced by kind of Calvinistic tendencies, unconsciously at least. He gave fodder to his cousin Spencer, who went all the way with this social Darwinism thing, which by the way was picked up by the Ku Klux Klan in the American South, and it's been the fodder for white supremacy, and so on. Even though there's very little evidence. And so Kropotkin said that in contrast to this social Darwinism, that humans are essentially beasts and all this, and it's all a matter of domination, and that basically valorizes domination, social, which is the issue. Kropotkin goes and he does his field research, unlike Darwin, who did his research in the tropics, where there's a lot of competition in nature. He did it in the Arctic, in Siberia. And in Siberia, the environment is really, really tough for life. And what he discovered, and he made a case, that organisms tend to have, they support each other. They learn, the organisms develop symbiotic relationships with one another. And he said, no, if you look at where things are really tough, okay, it actually reveals the deeper truth, which is that organisms support one another, that there's a symbiotic relationship built into nature. And this is like the birth of a key ecological idea, that systems are all self-supporting and interwoven and relational. And the basic thing is he took this and he translated this evolutionary insight into an anarchist theory. And he said that humans are, in our basic nature, cooperative and caring and supportive of one another. And we find ourselves in our relations with others, especially when we support one another. And that is part of what we do. And he says that this is the apotheosis of all of evolution, which is, not human aggression, but the opposite, human affiliation. And this is the thing. I think one of the things we can do is promote this science. It goes even further than that, okay? One of the deepest things about human biology is what's called paidogenesis or neoteny, which is that our bodies are designed, we are basically adult primate fetuses. We are fetal in our design. We are adults, we can reproduce while still being fetuses. And we are perpetually youthful. No matter how old you are, your body has these youthful structures, and that's what learning's all about. We are the being that can learn. We are capable of thinking and adapting and being flexible and changing our understanding of reality. And it's hardwired into the structure of our body, but we don't get taught this. This kind of pro-social understanding of our anatomy isn't taught. We are an affiliative, in our nature, we are affiliative, and all the positive things about all the religious systems and all the great spiritual leaders are affirmed in the very scientific structure of our bodies. It's all there. So the narrative, the Machiavellian narrative that we need to control everybody, and the Hobbesian notion that life is short, brutish, and whatever it is, brutish, short, and whatever, brutish. Okay, it's just not accurate. We need to get that out there, and I think that's the real idea here. That's the cornerstone of breaking the natural attitude that says we need to dominate nature, is understand that our nature is not something that needs to be dominated. Once we get that, then we understand that we have a different relationship with nature. Let me stop here. We're running on here.
No, it's excellent. What I'm really pulling out of what you're saying, and what I find so interesting is it's really a humanistic perspective, a humanistic ecology, right? That says that in order to understand how we're to relate to nature, we need to understand ourselves, right? And what you're doing here, before we got on here, I was talking about how a former student of Richard Carney's, and if you're going to be one of his students, you need to be able to do a bit of everything, be kind of all various, religion, philosophy, literature, art, poetry, science, whatever. You're running the gamut, and that's kind of what you're saying here is, you're talking about biology, but you're also talking about politics. And you at one point said art and literature play a role here. And you said religion plays a role here. And what you're really saying, I think, if I'm not summarizing it too reductively, is that if we're going to learn how to live in the world and of the world and in relation to the world and one another, we have to understand ourselves deeply as these beings who are relational in every aspect of what we do, biologically, with our anatomy, socially, with our politics, artistically and aesthetically, religiously. Like all of these things are in play here, and all of these things help us to understand ourselves better in order to understand one another and how we relate to others, and for this theme, the world itself, the earth, right, our environment. And so maybe just for our final kind of question here, our final conversation piece, I guess I'd like to trace a little bit more of the role that these other, we think of them as unique disciplines, right? Like literature, art, and science, but kind of the underlying connectivity between all of these things and how they relate to us, to who we are essentially, which is different from what we're taught to believe that we are, according to what you're saying, and how understanding these things better, how they all play a role. I was particularly interested, I told you, right now my big interest is literary theory, but how does art play a role in helping us to become better at understanding our relation to the world and so on?
Well, okay, I'll start with your last question and then sort of go into some of the weeds of the other things you talked about there. Art, okay, Nietzsche said famously, what's the point of life without music? And one of his consistent themes that the only way out is not just each other. Nietzsche needs to work on others a little better, but what he's right on about is that the answer, the way out, is art. And as a psychologist and someone who's trained as a therapist, all recovery involves expression. And what makes art is expression. And and I love Merleau-Ponty's. Again, I always come home to Merleau-Ponty. He's my knight in shining armor. He's so amazing. But and I hope he's talked about in this series. To exist is to express, and to be in psychopathology is to not be able to express. Okay, you could think of this almost in organic terms, in terms of organisms. They need to express. I think the way out is connection. And connection's got to be the watchword here. Okay, we're in a psychological crisis right now. I mean, the depression rates are amazing. the anxiety and the suicide amongst teenager, the rates just keep going up, and we're in a real mental health crisis. The drug addiction, and it's all because we're born into a world where there just is no hope for a really meaningful job, where you're disconnected from nature right away, you're disconnected from your body, you're disconnected from each other. A lot of it is this computer stuff. You you're isolated and cut off, and of course that's what leads to depression. And the way out is expression. The way out is relationship, which is always expression, and also receiving the expressions of others. That's of course part of art, is being receptive to aesthetics as well as expressing your aesthetics. So I think art, it's a big role. And I do think that it's also, in a dominating culture like our own, it's fascinating to watch it played out materially in the eradicating of arts from the curriculum in most schools, and the downplaying of its importance, and the treatment of it as if it's, just a sandbox that's unimportant. Art is essential to our human nature, and it's essential to our ability to function as humans. We have to have some element of expression. It could be a craft. It could be just being good at your job. It doesn't have to be Picasso. So that's really important. Now, let's go back to interdisciplinarity. I think one of the biggest threats to the whole crisis is what we academics are doing to ourselves with the insularity of the disciplines. And I think we know that it's wrong, that this kind of specialized disciplinary turf wars that we particularly constantly propagate within academia, we know it's wrong, but we can't stop it. We don't know how. It's sort of like Congress. They know what they're doing is wrong. They just don't know how to stop it. They're out of control. They get obsessive compulsive. And, we got to break the glass. We have to, the idea of these separate autonomous disciplines are really problematic. I mean, in the 60s was all about breaking the barriers between the disciplines. And we knew that interdisciplinarity had to be introduced to the academic world to solve these important problems. But it's not getting played out. Now, where interdisciplinary happens is scientists in the natural sciences, they have interdisciplinary, but they're only natural scientists. You don't have an interdisciplinary between natural scientists and social scientists and people in the humanities and the arts. We don't see that kind of spectrum. So we've kind of propagated the idea of interdisciplinarity and propagandized it, but it's not really happening. And we need like interdisciplinarity, we need to do what Merleau-Ponty does in his work, where he uses science, physical science, as a way of illuminating phenomenological ideas and vice versa. And he is also at the same time always hip to the idea that ultimately art is the primary paradigm of all human reality. It's the ultimate paradigm is art. And that is the real metaphor for what we are. And he understands social sciences and the physical as always within that context. He never leaves that. So real interdisciplinary has to happen, but how to do it, I don't know. I mean, it's just locked in. So I think of the academic world as a place to begin by creating interdisciplinary institutes that are focused on issues like the environment, or issues like that. And it has to be honestly interdisciplinary. It always defaults to naturalism. It always defaults the whole history of psychology is one long story of people trying to talk about subjectivity, but it gets defaulted back into objectivity, into naturalism. So how to do this in a way that doesn't default to just the physicalistic explanatory model, which is important. We don't want science denial, okay? It's important, but it needs to be placed properly. So that's the thing. Interdisciplinary is very hard to do, and it's hard to do in a capitalistic society where science gets priority because science delivers. Science delivers economically, and the social science and the humanities don't deliver in the same in an immediately visual way. So let me stop there.
I was just going to say, it seems like part of attaining, or at least moving toward these goals, is moving away from the view that we're all in competition with one another. I mean, you talk about the specialization of the disciplines, that fundamentally has to do with the fact that we're all competing and fighting for the resources and fighting for who gets the position, and we're concerned with getting ours, right? And so to move, just to kind of tie this last bit together to everything we've been saying from the start, to move from that kind of hyper specialized and truncated view of education and everything else is to move,
Competitive.
yes, is to move from the
Competition is
model,
domination.
is to move from the model where we
Yeah.
see ourselves as needing to dominate one another to one where, as you're saying, and I think persuasively, we need to cooperate with one another, and we're capable of that because, based on this conversation, that's really what's at the essence of human beings and our relation to the world, to ecology, and to one another. Those things are fundamentally tied together.
And it's not just beliefs. I mean, there's a lot of there's physical evidence to support this as well. These beliefs are founded on something, and we need to get that out there. And that's the soul. Of course, there's all the other details of implementing this a new pro-life. I don't. It's I'm sorry that's been incorporated elsewhere, but this human philic, okay, human philia, if an anthrophilic position would make us biophilic, you know, and I think they're one and the same thing. But we have to start with each other. And that's really tricky. We can't do unto nature what we can't do unto ourselves. We can't relate to nature in a positive way if we can't be positive with each other. Yeah, that's kind of it.
Well, Jim, thank you so much. This has really been excellent. I mean, hopefully this is a good starting point. This is the first talk that or conversation I'm having in this series, and it's been a pleasure and a great way for me to start off. And I know that there'll be lots of people who find it valuable as well. Just to conclude, again, this is part of the Hosting the Earth series through the Guestbook project in cooperation with the Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture series through the Lynch School at Boston College. And it's just been incredible to share a half an hour here with you and hear your ideas on this. So thank you so much.
Great. Yeah, my pleasure too. Thank you so much. All the best.